taking the PMP exam can be stressful, but preparing for it can also be stressful because you want to make sure you have a wide coverage, not only of the content, but also of the tricks that you need to know to remember the content. So in this presentation, I'm going to show you some powerful tips and tricks, like for example, understanding and remembering process groups, knowledge areas, the 49 processes, and the ITTOs, inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, brought to you by PMVersed. So one way to remember all the knowledge areas that exist in the PMP exam are to remember the chapters and to also use mnemonics. So if you correlate the chapter numbers in the PMBOK, you can see that chapter 4 correlates to integration, chapter 5 is with scope, chapter 6 with schedule, chapter 7 with cost, chapter 8 with quality, chapter 9 with resources, and so on. And so each of those, you can use the first letter of each word to create some sort of mnemonic that makes sense to you. So in this case, I'm using I should serve coffee for Queen Rose, cares for rolls with peanut scoops. So like that, you can just use each of those letters to remember each of the knowledge areas in the PMBOK. Another area to use mnemonics in is the process groups, and that's a little bit simpler, but some people may need it. There's 5 process groups to remember: initiation, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, and closing. And for those, you need to know some sort of mnemonic. You can use the I packed early morning clearly, and that way you remember each of those. Now, when we're talking about the PMP exam, one area that is of big struggle is remembering all the 49 total processes that are part of the PMBOK version 6. In this grid that you see, a very popular grid out there, is basically showing on the left all the knowledge areas that we talked about, the 10 knowledge areas that we talked about. And then on the top right, you can see the 5 process groups that we talked about earlier. So in each of those, you will see that the intersection between initiating and integration has an entry in this grid, which is develop project charter on the top left. So each of those represent a process. So the overlap of a knowledge area, a row with a column, is going to lead to a process. That's one of the 49 processes that you need to remember for the test. So you not only need to remember what the title of that process is, but you also need to remember what that process is about. And we're also going to talk about later on the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs that you need to remember for each. But for now, let's concentrate on the processes themselves. So one way to remember how to lay out all these processes is, I'm going to show you a quick way to do that. So first, we're going to remember basically a phone number, right? And this isn't a phone number that you need to remember. And don't even try to call them because I don't even know if it exists, but this is just a mnemonic. So remember the 766-436-3734, and that corresponds to each of the rows, as you see in red. Now, the second thing to remember is to remember the columns. And for that, I'm going to basically use 5 numbers, 2, 24, 10, 12, 1. And that corresponds to each of those columns, to each of the processes. Those numbers are basically telling me, for example, that for integration on that row, for that knowledge area, I'm going to have 7 processes on that row. And for initiating, I'm going to have 2 processes in that column. So in that way, once I laid them out, I'll be able to confirm that I got them right. Now, the third thing to remember is to start filling out the corners. The corners are so easy because there's just a handful of initiating and closing processes. So that's why there will only be a few. Actually, there's 3. There's only, for initiating, there's 2, and for closing, there's 1. So that's how you feel those corners. But there's always going to be one corner left out, which is the closing stakeholder grid at the bottom right. Now, the planning process group has processes in all knowledge areas. As you can see at the top is the most popular over here. So this is where we're going to spend most of our time per PMI framework. And so the intent here is to show you that there's quite many here. And as you learn the process, you'll be able to tell us what goes in each box. But for now, we know that we need to fill in all of them. Now, the next thing is for monitoring and controlling, we can remember this mnemonic, MCCCCMMCM. And that corresponds to all the M's and C's that this has. Basically, it has some sort of monitor or it has a control word at the beginning of each. So you just need to make sure you remember those. And then for executing, you're going, and actually for M and C, you're also going to have 2 extras, which are going in integration and in scope, the top 2. And then for executing, all executing have it basically, except those in the project management triple constraint, which is scope, schedule, and cost. Those will not have any process in them. And you also remember from those that manage, there will be 5 that start with manage, and the other 5 will be in the risk, resource, and integration. And the reason why we don't have anything in scope, schedule, and cost, as you're going to see as you study this, is because a lot of that is in the planning. Because in the planning, we're planning for what is it that we need to do, the scope, when do we need to do it, the schedule, and how much it's going to cost, the cost. And by the executing time, by the time we execute, we don't need to worry about that anymore, right? We're already executing our plan. So this is just a way for you to remember what goes in each of these grades. And some people like to actually do it quickly right before they start the test, fill out the grades so that they don't have to worry about it during the test. But it's up to you what works for you. Now, the way this works is in the middle, you have each of those project management processes, and each of those are going to have an input or one or more inputs, and they're going to have one or more outputs. And then they're always going to have them. And then there's going to be some sort of tool and technique or a list of them. Basically, how it reads is that you're going to have an input coming from another process. You're going to apply some tools and techniques, and that's going to translate into some sort of output. There's 600 ITTOs in PMBOK version 6. That means that there's 600 inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs in PMBOK version 6. So this is why we first focus on the understanding what each process is and what it does, and then you can focus on the inputs and outputs, tools and techniques. So like you see here, we can take one example in the integration knowledge area. And under initiating, we're going to take the develop project charter process. Just take a look at it, and then here I can show you that there's multiple inputs, there's multiple outputs, there's multiple tools and techniques, and that's how we know the develop project charter process comes about and what it produces in that output. So you're going to have to understand from these, what does a develop project charter does, what does it do, and then what it produces and what it took to produce. So one way to learn the 49 processes is to create these index cards with each of the processes that you're trying to learn, and then in the back put in the input, output, and at the bottom the tool and technique that you use for that. So you're going to study this every single day, making sure that it's not just memorization, but understanding and creating some sort of story on what is it that, why is it that some of these things are here, and so that way it'll lead you to what's the next process in this. And so that way you'll be able to do this every day, be able to put each of these cards under each of these process groups, and be able to study more. So I'm just trying to make sure that all my processes are laid out in this fashion. That's basically what you need to do to train your brain and to remember how these work. So another thing to remember, just check out our YouTube channel. We have a variety of videos. We also have our PMVersed Udemy courses and bootcamps. Check out the Earned Value Management Bootcamp for PMP and CAPM exams, and I will see you next time.